Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. It's been about a week since Russia launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. But away from the battlefield and beyond the immediacy of the escalating tensions between Russia, Ukraine, and their respective allies, attempts at a diplomatic solution continue. So tonight we try to understand the geopolitical undercurrents of a region that has seen tensions since the 2014 annexation of the Ukrainian region of Crimea by Russia. Dr. Julia Rocknefard is Assistant Professor at University of Nottingham, Malaysia, School of Politics, History and International Relations. She's also a consultant with the Moscow-based think tank Pearce Center. She joins us now. Julia, we understand that talks for a ceasefire are currently underway, but what do you think is the Russian endgame in this conflict?
Hi, everyone, and glad to be here with you. Well, that would be an interesting question because it depends from which vantage point we're going to look at it. And it depends if you're asking me about the position of Vladimir Putin's administration or what the experts might suggest. So the endgame, as we know, as it was declared, there was a concern about the security guarantees on the part of the security guarantees that Russia tried to negotiate with NATO and with the United States. And something apparently went wrong in that negotiations, which brought us to the current escalation. So initially, the purpose of the negotiations was to try to come to some common ground about security guarantees for Russia concerned with the expansion of NATO eastwards. However, when it comes to the military operation, the ongoing one, even though the negotiations are also underway, and hopefully we'll have some result sometime soon, their opinions split because to be honest with you, it's not very easy for me now to also talk to you about the matter because I have to juggle with multiple identities of my own as a Russian citizen and also as an expert, which I prefer to stay on the ladder because I guess it's easier for me.
So, Julia, sorry, if I can interrupt and jump in here. Maybe a way to help us understand this is, and you talked about Russian security concerns, and this is something that takes us back perhaps to the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And after that point, there was an agreement, I believe it's often mentioned, the Minsk Agreement, that laid the groundwork for some sort of we call it a détente between the contending forces. But in recent times, it was the recognition of the sovereignty of those two separatist regions in the Donbass, in the southeast of the Ukraine, that seemed to have precipitated things. What was going on there, and why has it gone from a simple recognition, or maybe not so simple, of sovereignty to a question of an invasion?
Well, it's also a complex question in the way that you put it, Sharad, because we all are more or less aware, I think, here that some kind of military action and tensions were persistent for the past 8 years in Donbass and Donetsk and Lugansk republics. And de facto, we can say that those were troubled regions, supported to one extent or another by Russia. Annexation of Crimea in 2014 served Russia's strategic interest, and there was a good justification of it. And seems the even our European partners more or less moved on with that. De facto, the region of Donbass was more or less under Russia's control for the past 8 years, and I haven't seen any vocal objections on the part of either Ukraine or the EU or the US. So the recognition of the two republics was rather a pathway for further military action, even though some of us, of the experts and Russian citizens, would think that maybe that step could have also been taken at this point, and then Moscow could have stopped, not to escalate this further. Because again, I'm repeating, de facto, those republics were under Russia's control, and they existed with Russia's support. Who paid salaries, who supported universities, and so on and so forth. How a state should function and how much resources it needs, all of us know. But unfortunately, Moscow hasn't stopped at that. And so this recognition rather served as a pathway to further military escalation. We could ask a question here, why it hasn't been done back in 2014 together with Crimea. But that brings us back to the strategic value of Crimea for Russia. You know, Russian fleet is based in there, and there was a concern in Moscow that the contract might not be extended for this important Russian naval base in the Black Sea by the new government of Ukraine. So Russia went ahead and took over. But also in Crimea, we can imagine that the perception of Russia taking over was slightly different compared to what could have happened in Donbass. Donbass didn't have that strategic value. Russia also took past 8 years to modernize its armed forces, and situation has improved significantly since, let's say, the conflict in South Ossetia. That's significant. And I guess currently
Right.
was less concern of the repercussions on the military front.
Okay. Well, I do want to ask you about the demands that Putin has made about assurances that NATO would stop reducing its growing military expansion eastward, and then also not to offer membership to Ukraine. Can I ask you about that role of NATO? I mean, yes, there's Putin bears primary responsibility for the Russian military offensive against Ukraine, but there's also a quarter century of expansion that NATO has done in the past 25 years or so that perhaps bears looking at as well. Could we look into that and the motivations of NATO?
Well, NATO, as I also often tell my students when we break this down in terms of global governance, NATO is an institution which we inherited since the era of the Cold War, and nevertheless, disregarding that its adversary dissolved, the CSTO, but NATO persisted in its existence, and we are not sure if it ever succeeded in redefining the purpose of its existence. So from Russia's vantage point, it is still seen as a very anti-Russian, since Russia is a successor of the Soviet Union, a very anti-Russian institution. And in that regard, we could say it is very much justified that it wouldn't like to see NATO, the hostile alliance, at its borders. And it is many of us very statist experts, not very statist, not very pro government experts, all of them were saying that it's quite justified, it's understandable. And here in that vein, we might see the argument that if Russia was basing its armed forces, let's say in Canada and Mexico, how people in DC would feel about that.
Okay, but I do want to ask you this, because we have seen some protests in Russia, and quite famously, a Russian member of a member of the Russian Duma, the parliament, said recently that he had voted for recognition of the two republics, but not for war. Now, the cost that this war is going to have, you say there's a military dimension to it, but there's also a social, economic, and political dimension for Russia in launching this war. Is that something the Russian public is going to accept, especially if this becomes a protracted conflict?
Yeah, that's a very valid, very legit question, Sharad. And this is what many of us I guess, have been crying on and off about. By crying, I mean literally crying for the past days, inside the country or outside, because we all see what kind of repercussions it will bring to us. And the European leaders have repeated over and over again that Vladimir Putin is going to pay a high price. He's going to pay dearly for this military operation. But let's not fool ourselves. The people of Russia are going to pay the price. The cooperation, the academic cooperation, cultural, medical, and we started seeing that. We started seeing the rise of Russophobia, the anti-Russian racism. I'm sure that somewhere in Western Europe, colleagues and friends are feeling it even more. The country is going to be thrown back many years back, and I wouldn't anticipate that that will dissipate in the decades to come, because it's going to stain, well, Vladimir Putin, yeah, but in the first turn, Russian citizens. And in that regard, what could have been done, because the sanctions that are being enacted right now by the EU, by the US, they are going to hit the Russian people the hardest. The well-being is going to plummet drastically. But what we would probably expect, but unlikely this is going to be happening, that these sanctions are going to be enacted against the Russian political elite, that the assets are going to be sanctioned, the assets of politicians with significant assets abroad in the UK in the first term, but also in other European countries, in the US, but
Right.
also of the children.
Right. Right, Julia, just to move very quickly, because we understand that some preparations were made to try to de-dollarize the Russian economy. Also, the agreement that between Putin and Xi Jinping is well telegraphed. We're told to watch China's reaction to this conflict, that China might provide a buffer. How do you see the role of China? I believe even India hasn't made a statement on the invasion yet. How will all these other powers play a role in how Russia copes with sanctions and other, non-military actions by Europe?
I think Russia has been, Putin's administration has been preparing for these sanctions. So did Europe, because the sanctions were not drafted overnight. Those are pages and pages, over 100 pages of documents. And of course, they were not verified, proofread overnight. So both parties were prepared. And from what I understand, that a lot has been purchased in advance, because Russia imports a lot of components, whatever you might think about in terms of its industrial production, even the military equipment, even the weapons production. A lot of it is being that which Russia prides itself, and fairly so. Still, some parts of it are imported from a variety of countries which are going to sanction Russia now. So some kind of stockpile was prepared, which will help it last for a while. But in the long term, and since we don't believe it's going to dissipate anytime soon, it's still going to hit Russia, going to hit its people. In terms of China, yes, definitely it might try to count on China's support, and I guess there will be such, but it will find oil and gas market in the face of China, for example. But again, in the long term, what China's policy would be. We believe that during the Olympics, President Putin traveled, and he actually spoke with Xi Jinping about that. So probably they agreed on something. But in the long term, we just have to wait and see. We have a case of Iran-China strategic partnership, and we closely, as a specialist on Iran and the Middle East, I've closely watched what has been happening to the country under heavy sanctions, cut off from financial system and whatnot for many years. And right there we can see that China's help might come as quite limited, despite them having a strategic agreement.
Julia, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. That was Julia Rognefard from the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kutin. Our next guest is Dr. Marnie Howlett. She's a departmental lecturer in politics at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. Her area of specialization is post-Soviet studies with a focus on Ukraine. Marnie, I'm just wondering if we could begin our conversation today looking at Ukraine and what kind of relationship it would like to have with Russia going forward, particularly now that we've seen the conflict escalate to this point.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think to answer that, we need to think about where Ukraine fits within a historical context, specifically within the context of the Soviet Union. So Ukraine was under control by the Soviet regime for many, many years. However, it has been an independent state, like all of the former republics have been since 1991. With that, Ukraine has continued to fight for its independence. We saw that in 2004, 2013, 2014 more specifically, and then with the ongoing conflict in Donbass. So going forward, I think what Ukraine wants is what it has wanted since 1991 is to be an independent state, to be recognized as a sovereign territory that is separate from Russia.
So, Marnie, of course, what Russia wants, at least as stated in recent days, is Ukraine to be neutral, not to join NATO, and to reassure Russia that its security is not in any way threatened by the ambitions of Ukraine or aspirations of Ukraine. How do we square this particular conflict, perhaps, of aspirations?
Yeah, I think one thing we need to think about is the fact that Ukraine has been neutral since 1991. It has not been part of NATO and it has not been part of the EU, despite civil society's desire to do so. I think in this way, while Russia frames it as a threat, Ukraine frames Ukraine being part of NATO as a threat to the Russian regime. I think what we need to understand is that actually it is a threat in the fact that it represents a loss of territory and perhaps even the collapse of what was once an empire. And so in this way, Russia does feel threatened, but perhaps not for the fact that NATO would be up against it, but more so the fact that it does symbolically represents that the empire it once had is no longer.
Right. So what do you think is the end game for Russia? What do you think Putin has in mind with for this, the end game of this conflict?
To be honest, I think this is something that only Putin knows. I think we can see that there is a desire for more territory. We see Russians continuing to push into Ukraine. Beyond this, though, I don't know if we can predict how this will end, nor can I say, what Putin desires. But I do think there is something to be said for what Russia once represented and what Putin wants to continue with that.
Can we talk about 2014, the annexation of the Crimea that seems to have been, in some sense, accepted by all stakeholders in Europe, the annexation, and in fact, the ongoing separatist issues in southeast Ukraine. So the two regions that declare themselves separate and was recently recognized by Russia, is that also a part recognition on the Ukraine from the Ukraine government that they have to play a slightly different game? They haven't demanded the return of Crimea or those areas in the Donbass, have they?
No, at this point, they haven't. And I think we do need to recognize the significance of these places within, again, the historical context. Crimea, particularly, as well as Donbass, was Russia's for quite a long time, and it was gifted. Crimea specifically was gifted to Ukraine. Donbass historically was also part of Russia's territory, and so for this reason, there are many individuals living there who identify as ethnic Russians and who would desire for that place to be part of Russia's territory. I think the Ukrainian government is aware of this, and for that reason, this is why we see the conflict happening at the local level and have since 2014. There is a clash between the individuals who see their territory as part of Ukraine versus those who see it as part of Russia. To be honest, they do have a right to feel such way because it was part of Russia's territory for a long time. And so this is something we do need to realize, is that it is much more complicated than where the state's borders have been drawn since 1991, as there are these underlying historical memories of what was once Russia's territory.
Well, if we were to just say take a look from 2014 and the Ukrainian administration's response, or I guess its actions since then, I'm just wondering, how has it responded? How has it played its cards? Were there perhaps missteps by the Ukrainian administration or Zelensky administration that may have, perhaps averted the conflict?
I can't speak so much to President Zelensky's actions and whether or not that would have changed what we see in the current day. However, I can say that there is a sentiment in civil society at the grassroots in Ukraine to push towards membership within NATO and within the EU. Perhaps that has grown since 2013, 2014. I don't study protest movements, and I can't speak to that specifically. However, we did see that desire in 2013 and 2014 with Yanukovych being pushed out. This likely has only grown since then. And so I think it might not be on the government as much as a greater desire within civil society for a new direction for the country.
Mani, we've seen thousands of people flee, Ukrainians and non-Ukrainians trying to flee the conflict zone, but because Zelensky and others have stayed put and are putting up a fight, what kind of resources does he have to sustain a resistance against Russian invasion? And to what extent will that require help from outside? And will that expand the theater of conflict?
I think it's a complex question. Again, I don't study military affairs specifically. However, we do know that Ukraine has a military, and the military has been trained in recent years by Western forces from a variety of countries. So they are well equipped in some ways. In terms of artillery, I think we are seeing some European Union states helping and sending aid where they can. And we also know that there is a very strong volunteer battalion on the ground. Many Ukrainians, especially in recent days, men and women, many without any military experience, are coming forward and volunteering their services to fight. I can speak personally and say I know individuals who have no military experience who are currently on the front lines in different parts of the country. So with this, we see a very strong reaction from the Ukrainian people, including the president himself, to defend the country. But we also see more civil society activism and other ways that individuals are pushing back, such as breweries brewing Molotov cocktails. We see individuals helping wherever they can within their local communities. So I think perhaps not on the military front, but more in terms of what's happening at the grassroots, there is significant resistance by the Ukrainian people, and perhaps not even to the extent that Putin foresaw prior to the invasion.
I mean, there's such a high price to pay with war. I'm just wondering what you will see as the cost on Ukraine if this conflict turns out to have protracted violence.
I think the cost is much more beyond Ukraine. I think Ukraine is fighting for the free world. I think they are fighting a war for not only Europe, Western Europe, but for democracy globally. The impacts of war infrastructurally and materially will very much be felt in Ukraine, and has already been felt in Ukraine in terms of the destruction, both in terms of human lives, but as well as the infrastructure destruction we can already see. Beyond that, though, the international market will be affected. We see this inflation is being affected across the world. We see already, the Russian ruble is majorly affected with their investments and the sanctions. These will have costs much beyond the post-Soviet region, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Marnie, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sharing your insights. Marnie Hollop, politics lecturer at the University of Oxford. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kudin, signing off the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.